You know, in addressing matters like this, I always like to use a little story just to create context, because I feel like stories were the basis for all discussions of this sort, and without a story in place, people don't tend to really respond to this sort of discussion. Imagine that astrology, as opposed to astronomy, is the wife in a household relationship, in your standard, heteronormative sort of setting, and astronomy is the husband. And at one time in human history, these two got along really, really well, and they built a wonderful home for their children, which is all of us. And then they had a split, a falling out, a divorce, and astrology started to take care of the children. Or maybe they split custody. But then and astronomy kind of went off on its own and didn't give a damn about astrology for several years, until one day it came back and decided to tell astrology all the things that it was doing wrong. Astrology says, "What do you mean? You're the one who set us up in this bad situation to begin with." And astronomy says, "Yeah, well, at least I admit it. So now you have to do things my way because, yeah, I fucked up the first time, but now I'm better, so you gotta take me back." And I have to say, if you've ever gone through a tough breakup and you show up at your ex-girlfriend's house 4 months later, it doesn't always work that way. Doesn't mean that it shouldn't, but it doesn't. And this is my point, that it bothers me. It really rustles my jimmies, as the kids like to say, that people nowadays consider themselves scientific by dismissing things like astrology. Because it is true, they'll admit that at one point astrology was scientific, but rather than working towards the credit of astrology, especially in informing astronomy and balancing the two, there is something very peculiarly human in how we structure our societies, and this is a mistake. This is a moral mistake. This is a logical lapse in reasoning that biases us in favor of whoever we consider to be the dominant household owner, basically. And as much as you can say that this is me speaking from my own experience, as someone who has not been a homeowner in the traditional sense, a long-term provider or something, not only would this criticism be symptomatic of our times, which are in many cases considered fallen, especially from the Hindu perspective, where being the provider economically is not in any way the measure of a man, though it's a mistake that we were predicted to make. But also, it would reflect your own biases as someone living in a society which is profoundly flawed on so many ways that we can't even agree, we can't even come to a common agreement about what is flawed about it. And politics always proves that to us. It kind of shows us who we really are and just how confused we are as a total species. The thing is, astrology has been taking care of us for a long time. Astrology has helped us find meaning in the heavens. It hasn't reduced everything to simply spiraling balls of gas and seemingly random forces in which we're caught up, but against which we have to fight. You see, the 20th century was all about that. The best thinkers from the 20th century still believed, fundamentally, that the universe was absurd, apathetic, irrational, and that we had to protest it in this sort of Sisyphean, Camusian way. And there's something really noble about that. There's something really wonderful about being able to come to work at a job that sucks and knowing, at least, whatever I do, it's all equally absurd. Like, there's a freedom in that, isn't there? There's a profound sense of joy and exuberance in knowing that it doesn't matter, but what happens when it does? What happens when you've been overlooking something time and time again in your life, and finally it hits you, finally someone opens up your eyes to it, and you're like, oh my God, how did I not see these trends before? And you realize I did. I just didn't know what they were called. It's like someone who's an atheist, but who has such a profoundly religious devotion for this underlying order to the universe, to nature. And people keep telling him, no, nature is absurd, it's chaotic, it doesn't have anything to do with what we say. But you keep saying, but even absurd and chaotic, they make sense. And then you realize, that's what God meant all along. Well, maybe you're going through your life, and you realize you've had these friends over here and these enemies over there, and these people that, you know, you thought they were your friends, they let you down, and you find a pattern, and then it's like this other pattern that these other people found, and then you realize, wow, why is it that all of these people seem to be born around the same time of the year? Of course, astrology accounts for that. It explains how the time of your birth, the condition of the world around you at the time that you were conceived and the time that you were born, fundamentally shapes your relationship to the universe throughout an entire lifetime. And considering the fact that your lifetime is actually fairly short, the changes that you go through will be pretty minuscule compared to who you were when you were born. Because anything that was going on at the time that you were born is of such a massive scale, surpassing that of any one lifetime. I mean, it takes just so long for Pluto, you know, to go around the sun. It just takes so long for the universe to move into a new position, and yet nonetheless, everything that happens to you at the moment of your birth is completely unique. All these gears are in an entirely unique alignment, which creates your personality. And then there are your decisions, which really, if anything, are like decisions in a decision-based game, which invoke certain personality types rather than others. But you're choosing from a given set of personality types which you were given at your moment of birth. And this would account for a number of things. This would go beyond the distinction of nurture and nature. It would be essentially like nurture is all your social functions, nature is all your biological functions, but who you are as a soul, beyond your functions. You know, if you look at yourself as more than your functions in this Marcellian way, because Gabriel Marcel would say it's a mistake of modernity that we reduce ourselves to our functions. If that would be covered by something that's mystical like astrology, and something that's profoundly personal, that personalizes the world rather than depersonalizing it. And you should know that the world is so incredibly personal in your relationship to it, that whenever you pretend that it's not personal, it hits you that much harder when it is. Because only by understanding yourself, as the ancient Greeks knew, can you truly understand the world. You're not complete in a world of statistical truth, as Carl Jung would put it. So why do people not believe in astrology? It's because it's not scientific. Karl Popper, the greatest philosopher of modern science, said it's not scientific. But why is it not scientific? Well, he says it's because it cannot be proven. It cannot be disproven. Science, in order to be science, in order to be constantly growing as a machine, a mechanism of our knowledge, has to work through trial and error. This is the Aristotelian method. This is how Alexander the Great became great, by conquering all these countries, by just faking it until he made it. Alexander the Great was using the Aristotelian method of just trying things out and seeing what worked. And only by accepting his failures can he move on. This is how we're taught. Especially in a culture which is extroverted. Aristotle, Carl Jung compared Aristotle to the ideal extrovert. And Plato was the ideal introvert. But Aristotle was a Platonist. Aristotle was a student of Plato. Aristotle himself, the founder of modern physics and science as we know it, the scientific method that Western culture has forced upon the world in this Alexandrian way. Aristotle himself said physics is secondary to metaphysics. What's metaphysics? Is it just superphysics? No. In this case, the millennial usage of the word meta is actually very appropriate, because millennials tend to use the term meta to describe that which is beyond another level. And that's actually what meta means. Metaphysics goes beyond physics. You see, the Aristotelian method, the scientific way of doing things through trial and error, is just one way of doing them. But Aristotle is considered the greatest Platonist because he understood his own ignorance. Just like Socrates, who taught Plato, understood his own ignorance. He understood that there was something beyond science itself. And Plato's method is brilliant on its own terms, and it's just as important. When civilization was peaking in the Renaissance, and you might say our technology was not really up to speed yet, nonetheless, civilization, the position of the human being in a society, before the human being could become depersonalized through technology and turned into a form of technology. When civilization was at its finest point, not that it was perfect, not that the society was perfect, but when it was as humanly good and noble as it could be, it stressed the balance between the Aristotelian way and the Platonic way. You know, you look at the school of Athens, that brilliant painting with all those philosophers, right at the center and the top of this triangle are Plato pointing up at the heavens and Aristotle pointing out at the world. And we learned this in high school, didn't we? I should hope. Or middle school. But we forget that both methods are necessary, or at least both are equally valid. You see, from Aristotle we get all our sciences, but from Plato we get all our religions. But it's only through combining the two can we be complete human beings. Because there are things that just require us to go off of faith and intuition and everything Platonic about us. In fact, we act on that all the time, even when we invest that religiosity in science. Since everything in science can be disproven, as our common sense changes, or as more evidence comes in, since everything in science can be disproven, for that reason, it is never complete. So, acting as though you know the truth because science gives it to you is not scientific. That is religious investment in an Aristotelian method. It is fanaticism of a religious sort towards something given to you by the clergy. Only in this case, the clergy is a scientific community. Now, I know a good deal about this scientific community, not because my parents were biochemists. And it's not as though I know a great deal about biochemistry. I've certainly tried to take some classes and it didn't do very well. But what I do remember to this day, from even my childhood, was all of the conflict that working as a biochemist brought upon my family. Especially in dealing with all of the bullshit. Some of you might remember Breaking Bad. There was that wonderful monologue that was given by Gail Bedecker about the learned astronomer and, that old Walt Whitman poem. And he was talking about how, one of the things about that he deplored about being a professional scientist was all the non-science that went into being that way. And it reminded me, while I was watching the show with my mom, it actually reminded me very vividly of something that I remember from my childhood when she was having a conversation with my father about a meeting with her boss that went really badly. And at some point, my mom during that meeting had ostensibly said, "Can we just talk about the science?" because she had to remind her boss that it wasn't about all the other things that went into being a boss. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the prestige. It was not about giving the people what they want, even when they're supporting you and funding you. Because the truth doesn't always bend to that. It's not human-centered. We're not living at the center of the universe here. At least, even if we were, we don't know that for 100% of a fact, and any other place in the universe could theoretically be considered the center of the universe, because we might not even be living in an exclusively three-dimensional plane. Now, my mom didn't say all of that, but she did have to remind her boss of even the very basics of what they were working with. And in many ways, biochemistry at least deals with basic things. It deals with basic things that we can observe here on Earth as life forms. It doesn't really concern itself very much with the possibilities of extraterrestrial life, either on this three-dimensional plane or on other dimensions. That is confined, so to speak, to science fiction. Yet, you see, to the same extent that could be considered a confinement, socially, it is a liberation spiritually, that we can dream, that we can imagine other forms of life on other planets and in other dimensions of existence as well, along whose axes we've not yet traveled. You see, my point here is that our society is not scientific because it treats science as an organization, a religious clergy, and any kind of religious clergy always tends to interfere with the direct experience of religion through mysticism. So it is that any kind of scientific clergy that has to concern itself with power and with position in a society and with money interferes with individuals who are trying to break out and explore what is truly unknown. You see, science has been defined by Bertrand Russell as that which we know, whereas philosophy is defined as that which we don't know. Well, obviously, if our scientific knowledge is always insufficient, if it's always incomplete, if that frame of reference is never 100%, then that means that we always start with philosophy. That's not something that a scientific culture, a truly scientific culture, can dismiss. It always did start with philosophy. It began with what we don't know. We imagine what could potentially be. So how does this apply to the situation of astrology? Well, theoretically, and this is where our religious background really screws us over, because of our religious clergy. See, our religious clergy told us for ages and ages that the earth is fallen from heaven. It's exceptional. It is exceptionally bad. It is right between heaven and hell. That's how imperfect the human condition is. And that lingers throughout all Western history, even well into the 20th century, even in the most rigidly atheistic of philosophies. Even Jean-Paul Sartre and Nietzsche had this conception of a fallen world. A world that's not made for us. And that's out of alignment with the rest of the universe. Now, what does that entail? Let's say, for instance, that we find out that the Earth is not a perfect sphere, and it's spinning at an angle, and over a very long period of time, but nonetheless still within the confines of human civilization. Little by little, it gets thrown off. Things which were once true from a human perspective are no longer true, and therefore we're expected no longer to believe in them. You see, this is a reflection, a retelling of the story. This makes sense because of how we were raised. A retelling of the story of man's fall from grace, At one point, human beings were God's beloved, perfect children in a perfect earth, Garden of Eden. And we were totally in alignment with the heavens. This is why all atheists should study religion, by the way, because they'd see how much religion is in their common sense. Totally in alignment with the heavens, but then things fell. They fell into disarray, into decay. They went off center, and we were moved east of Eden. That same way of thinking, that same mimetic disease, is reflected in the notion that at one point astrology made sense because of where the earth was in relationship to the universe, but they did not know at that time that the earth was flawed. And once they saw themselves and saw that they were naked, that is when things went awry. That is when innocence was lost. That is when we left Eden and we realized that actually astrology can't be true because the earth is imperfect. The earth is spinning at an axis, and that throws off the whole damn thing. Wrong. It doesn't, because all that sums up is our scientific knowledge at present about the three-dimensional position of the earth. One thing I would like to posit as a philosophical idea, for which I have no scientific evidence, but which I don't need in order to posit it, is the possibility that on a fourth dimensional plane, or maybe a fifth dimensional plane, anything higher than the third dimension, anything greater than the known world, there are metaphysical forces that continue to this day to affect us here on earth in the same way as they did previously. Now, we don't have names for them, so be it. Most of the physical forces that we knew about by force of necessity, things like gravity, things that we needed for our technology, most of those things, in fact, are most of those things we didn't even discover until very, very recently. And I want to really give you a moment to consider that. Because I'll give you a moment to consider that. We didn't really know much about what the physical forces were until the last century or so. The strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, even the force of gravity and how it worked on a subatomic level, even the subatomic level itself, was very, very recent acquisition of science. And keep in mind that this recent burst in scientific knowledge, which so fascinates us and stimulates us and makes us feel so powerful, happened at a time when human society became so incredibly structured and authoritarian that some of these discoveries were being made by Nazis. You know? And somehow we look back on human history and we think about how terribly oppressive human beings have always been to each other. But when you really pay close attention, it was always with the consent of the ruled, because human beings had a religious instinct. They had a sense of who they were in the universe. That was what allowed them to justify such institutions such as the Catholic Church. You know, one comedian, Doug Stanhope, said, if you look at the Nazis side by side with the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church got away with a lot more over a very long period of time, whereas the Nazis were only around for a very short period of time and had their asses handed to them in World War II. But what I would maintain is more noble about the Catholic Church is that it actually won the consent of the ruled, not through sheer force of will, but through appealing to a sense of human meaning. And that is what we're always looking for. We're always looking for something that gives us a sense of meaning in the world and a position of responsibility in the universe. So consider this too. Consider several dots on a line. They just occur at different points on that line. And at every point, it's a different y-axis. If you're looking at this one-dimensionally and your whole world is just that one line, then every one of these dots would be completely different from one another. Because they all occur at different y-axes, and the y-axis is all you know. That's the only difference that truly matters to you. But if you expand your consciousness to include two dimensions, and this is reduction, but at the same time, I hope that you'll see by analogy how other forms of reduction are ridiculous this way. It's sort of a satire of our way of thinking. Supposing that you discover that there's a y-axis and an x-axis. Now, if you consider that x-axis to be of equal value to the y-axis, you can also see how, I'm not just using verbal filler here, I mean literally you can see how there is, how both of those dimensions matter, but, they matter in different ways. While these dots are in different positions on that plane, they still make a pattern. There is a relationship between them which is consistent and significant. A trend. A trend not unlike the trend that you see in personality between people who are Pisces or between people who are Scorpios or Tauruses or Cancers or so on and so forth. Fact of the matter is, these trends, all of existence is a series of these patterns, to our knowledge. And this is why nothing is truly random, because even on a subatomic level, you can see patterns. And that there are forces at work, perhaps metaphysical forces, which also determine what it is about the position of Uranus or the position of Neptune about you. And they're so recognizable that some people could just look at you and be able to tell what your sign probably is, or at least what predominates in your chart based on the decisions that you're making at that time. It would not be negligible. Speaking of negligibility, what if a force such as this, if it were confined to a two-dimensional plane, a two-dimensional ballpark, so to speak, what if it had nothing to do with the y-axis? What if it had everything to do with the x-axis? Now this would be a bit of a reduction. But supposing we lived on a y-axis, or we lived on that line, so we're really living on an x-axis, but we're living on that line, and all that we know in terms of considerable differences, practical differences that can be practically applied in this Aristotelian way, is determined by our position along the y-axis, our y values, so to speak. Strain your mind a bit to imagine this. But there's another world that's perpendicular to us, and the way that it works depends entirely upon the x-axis. And because we're all living at the same x value, from its dimension, from its limited perspective, or its rules and regulations, our differences don't really matter. Well, time and time again in science itself, you also see this. From a certain perspective, we're all pretty much identical. We're all pretty much equal. We're all mostly made up of the same genetics as a banana. But from another perspective, it makes all the difference in the world. What your genes are. Your gender doesn't necessarily affect your hair color, because those are different genes. You see? So it's not ridiculous to suggest that perhaps all these discrepancies in astronomy, three-dimensionally, have no effect whatsoever on whatever it is that makes astrology work. And it does work. It just works in a different way than our technology works. Now, what is technology? Technology is a synthesis of science and art. It is a synthesis of the Aristotelian ideals and the Platonic ideals. This is why the Renaissance, even though it wasn't as technologically advanced as we are, still brought forth technological innovators, such as Da Vinci. Because to be an agent of technology is to be a sort of Renaissance man or woman. Now, look at how our society condemns people for trying to be that. You know, our society rewards success when it is popular and applicable, and when it is critically acclaimed. But it condemns the attempt. You see, when an artist is starting out in Hollywood, he's oftentimes told that he's already failed for trying. He's at least treated that way, as though he's already failed for trying. And this is an immoral thing. Because without the attempt, you can't have the success. People benefit from the success. They gladly enjoy your success. But the moment that you try, it's almost as though you've already failed. And it's that specific kind of limitation that increases the risks of failure. And so long as the risks of failure are increased, Hollywood can remain an exclusive society. And it's the same thing that can be said of the music industry. It's the same thing that can be said of the scientific community as well. You see, scientific community is relatively easy to get into if you follow all the rules. But what happens when you start breaking the rules? What happens when you start doing experiments on things like morphic resonance? Or when you push a theory that says that at some point we were all one civilization that can be observed having all these things in common and that had a very profound relationship to the heavens that connected us, but then we fell apart. In a cataclysmic event that is reported time and time again throughout the various religions that would be vestiges of that civilization. Well, Ted doesn't like that. The band TED Talks, Rupert Sheldrake and Graham Hancock. What is it about these men that was not scientific about them? They were totally scientific, but they weren't playing the game by the rules. Theoretically, according to existing scientific knowledge, according to what the clergy has already given you, those theories can't be true. But that could be considered an error in science itself. Look back on why it is that Karl Popper, in his typical bias, one actually rather typical of a Leo, to think of it, said that astrology can never be scientific. Well, the reason he says that it can't be scientific is because it cannot be disproven. And he's very biased in favor of science, so if it's something that can't be disproven, he presumes that all of our knowledge will always be imperfect. But what if, on another dimension, things are so incredibly clear that if we could just see it for just a few moments, we would never be able to disbelieve in it? See, Plato believed that that's what we have to do. That is how we arrive at the truth. We see it with such awe. It's ideal. But there are people who are so incredibly Aristotelian that they can't stand that possibility. They can't stand the possibility of that kind of perfection, so they need to believe that only something which constantly needs revision, constantly needs trial and error in an Aristotelian way can be true. And that is arrogant. See, it's dressed up as though it were humble, as though it were admitting to one's own fallibility, but it's precluding the possibility that one can be more. And so by precluding that, it is already, it's like that joke about the optimist and the pessimist. Both the optimist and the pessimist believe this is the best of all possible worlds. It's just the optimist sees this as the greatest world imaginable, and the pessimist says, well, it's not the greatest world imaginable, but it's the best that we can get. There's something pessimistic about Karl Popper that is very arrogant, because in many ways typical of a Leo, and believe me, I've lived with a Leo, especially a Leo scientist. There's something that says all that we can ever be is imperfect. And by that, it enthrones that imperfection as though it were a form of perfection. It's also reflected in his politics. He says, everything, all of man's attempts to create heaven on earth have given us nothing but hell. So this precludes the need to try to be more. And it's rather narcissistic. It's as though to say, we don't really need to try because this is as good as it's going to get. And in practical applications, it's the same as saying, I'm perfect already. The pessimistic point of view and the optimistic point of view are really arrive at the same conclusion, that this is the best of all possible worlds. Which means that even though you know that your scientific knowledge will always have to be revised, and it's a Sisyphean task because you never break through. You never transcend the human condition. You never see the fourth dimension for a moment. But people do. They're just don't tend to be scientists. They tend to be mystics. You know, Einstein towards the end of his life was a mystic because he understood his own ignorance so profoundly he was willing to go beyond science into the realm of things which lie outside of science. Perhaps science is just a three-dimensional tool. Maybe if we really want to explore other dimensions, we have to sometimes let it go and open ourselves up to other possibilities, other forms of arriving at the truth. You know, all human history has been a constant humbling of ourselves. First, we believed that we were at the center of the universe. We found out it's probably not so. Then we believed that, well, maybe our sun, which we worship, is at the center of the universe. It's probably not so. Or at least that's arbitrary. It might as well be called that, but you might as well call it Alpha Centauri, the center of the universe. And then, and we always seem to presume that there was this unsplittable force, this constituent of nature called the atom, the uncuttable, because we could not cut it. And look at how much devastation it took to prove us wrong and to prove that the atom in fact can be split. And only very recently do we understand the implications of that, and we see patterns on a subatomic level. We're always at war with ourselves about whether this is random or orderly. But we get the point is that it's all us. We have a personal relationship with it. But we are not necessarily at the center of it. And that's what's humbling about it. So, look at two positions, therefore, on astrology. You could say, on one hand, that the biggest bodies, the greatest, closest celestial bodies, greatest in mass and in energy to us, have no sway whatsoever on our lives. It's just our egos bouncing around of our own free will. And no sociological trends can be linked to those great, massive giants that we gave at an earlier time in history the names of gods, in which we still, give names of gods. Though perhaps in some distant future we will, like in Fight Club, name them after, corporations or something stupid like that. You could say that. Or you could say, look, all of our scientific knowledge has no sway whatsoever upon the sheer power of these gods over our lives, which even the ancient Greeks had the humility to admit. Even before Plato, even before Socrates, they had the humility to admit that there were metaphysical forces at work that were visible to everyone in the community, regardless of who you were. You could see it if you choose to pay attention. Now look, obviously as we open up our minds to more and more dimensions, we have to be as inclusive as possible. However, in disowning our previous ignorance, we shouldn't presume that there aren't forces of the world which operate in similar confinements. Remember my analogy to the one-dimensional beings, or one-dimensional men, who, sorry, that was a philosopher joke, who kind of all live on one line. And from their perspective, they're all different because they have different Y values. But the moment that you see them in the context of a two-dimensional plane, you see that they are different, but nonetheless, they are positioned in a pattern. Okay, but what's more important? The x-axis or the y-axis? Okay, an all-inclusive definition says they're equally important. But what if there were a force that were perpendicular to us? Not necessarily an observer, just a force. And from its perspective, we're all the same. Because it only takes into consideration x values, and we all occur on the same x value. Now, that could happen. There are certain ways in which the universe itself, by having patterns, having rules, operates within restrictions. It is in some way also reductionistic, but it's not reductionistic in the same way that we are. So you could say just as well that from the perspective of the astrological forces, it doesn't matter that our Earth is spinning at an axis. It doesn't matter what the night sky looks like when we look up. It simply is, and it remains that way. And we just glimpse it from time to time. And we derive this knowledge, we learn it, and then the more that we learn it, the more we see it. And that's not confirmation bias. It is actual access to a world beyond our three-dimensional knowledge. Now, this does presuppose a certain reduction. It does presuppose that something does not matter. That something which appears great, our scientific knowledge, which appears so inclusive and overwhelming to the one individual scholar, doesn't matter. But consider that the same reduction occurs in the alternate theory, which says that everything that goes on around us in this universe does not affect our day-to-day decisions. The fact remains the same fallacy is being committed by both parties. But which one is more stupid? Which one is more arrogant? Which one is more archaic and human-centered? Obviously, it would be the presupposition which actually acts in both cases. The presupposition that dismisses astrology by presuming on human knowledge, on human science. And that just as easily presumes on the human will. You see, why would someone criticize my theory? They would say, it's not scientific, it hasn't been scientifically proven. They're presuming that there cannot be a force so great that it would dwarf our scientific knowledge, because our scientific knowledge is human. It's not a god. It doesn't rule over our lives. And the same bias is presented in the alternate theory. Not to say that both theories are equally biased. No. I'm saying the criticism of the one theory is also reflects the same bias that upholds the other theory. What negates one theory upholds the other theory. I'm not saying that they're both equal. Far from it. This bias is that human beings their wills are so powerful that no God and no metaphysical force from very far away in the heavens could sway it. See, Plato wouldn't have thought that way. Even Aristotle wouldn't have thought that way, but the modern human being does. And this is how the modern human being has regressed to a human-centered state, which is not even scientific. You see. Now, what biases does this reflect on my own part, you might say? I mean, theoretically, if what condemns one theory and elevates another is a human-centered bias, then there must be another bias, on the other hand, which elevates my theory and condemns the popular one, or the dismissive one. It's not even popular. Well, my bias is in favor of my own experience. But what if that experience is all we have? What if our experience, and more than our experience, our relationships to the universe, are constantly being filtered through a system, a clergy, a power structure that tells us which experiences are true and which are not true, what's crazy and what is sane. Fundamentally, we know that arrogance is unscientific. We know that it's ridiculous to suppose that we are, to presume that we're alone in the universe, that we're the only life forms in the universe, that we're at the center of the universe, that our technological limitations represent absolute scientific fact until, the atom bomb proves us wrong. We know the dangers, even to us, of thinking that way, of that hubris. So what's my bias? My bias is in favor of the humanities, which teach us, time and time again, not to be arrogant. Not to presume, on the one hand, that those forces cannot affect us, because they cannot affect our personalities, not affect our wills, not affect our biases and our filters of perception. And also, on the other hand, to presume that those forces cannot dwarf our scientific knowledge. You see, once you have that human-centered bias, you can easily point the finger at my theory and say, that's ridiculous. I mean, how can you just exclude science from the gods? But then again, how can you just exclude the gods from your human will? It's just as biased. It's just as exclusive. It's just as reductionistic. But we don't notice that. See, it's not even that being reductionistic is the fallacy here, but not being even able to see your own reductionism in condemning someone else's absurd reduction. That is even worse, because it reinforces a religious attitude of authority, of a clergy, of an orthodoxy of thinking, which is alien to everything that science was supposed to be, and alien to everything that philosophy was supposed to be, and alien to everything the human race. Being said, I mean, aliens are pretty cool, but we wouldn't even be able to conceive of them if we didn't have an imagination. I guess that's what it comes down to, Astrology and things like astrology require your imagination. They require leaps of faith. They require you to go beyond logic. And unfortunately, it seems that one of the vestiges of, one of the symptoms of living in a fallen time is that we've lost that. Most of the really great ideas that we have right now are recycled. And it's because we condemn genius. We condemn people for attempting something. I worked as a dishwasher. And the dishwasher is someone who's in a very peculiar position because he has to take so much crud from everybody, physically and emotionally. He has to answer to everyone else in the kitchen. He's treated as though he were at the bottom of a hierarchy. even though his job is incredibly important and incredibly difficult and requires a lot of thinking on his own feet and thinking for himself, because all these different people who are telling him how to do it properly are telling him different things. They just want the results. And even if they've been there before, they did it in different ways, and it's arrogant to presume that you know how to dishwash properly, because there's so many factors that go into it, and you're never going to get a perfect result in a successful business. There's just too many dishes to be washed. Now, sometimes it does feel, when you're in that kind of position, like everyone's against you. Like everyone around you can agree about one thing, and that it's your responsibility, and whatever goes wrong is your fault. They can't agree about how they're going to help you. They can't agree about what the best way of doing things is. They can't give you an example to set, but they expect you to follow them. And so there's an absurdity to that. There is, like I said, something noble in contending with an absurdity. And you definitely learn that when you're in a position like a dishwasher. For instance, you realize that some people really love being dishwashers and are great at it. But you might be better at being a cook, but they won't let you be a cook until you become great at being a dishwasher. And some people never get the chance to cook because they're stuck doing that job. And it's this merit system which is completely arbitrary. But the way that the corporation gets away with it is because this is how, so long as people go along with it, so long as people get out of the dish pit, get promoted, everyone stays in line. Things remain the same. It's a status quo. And a growing mind is the one that suffers the most in these situations. I mean, there's another sort of emotional strain that comes upon the mind that's completely stuck up its own ass. But you get the idea. Well, a lot of things in human society are still structured in this hierarchical way. It's not conducive to creativity or to productivity even. And the reason that they continue this is because something like being a dishwasher is so incredibly important that you can treat people like crud, because so many people want to do it. So many people are willing to do it that employees are expendable. That's just the paradox of it. And this is why, this is why people frown upon artists. It's because there's so many of them trying to do it, and the people in control, the people at the top of the hierarchy, make sure that only a few people make it in. And in fact, the greater the difficulty presented by the community to the individual, the easier it is to weed out individuals, and the easier it is to make sure that the people who get in are the most ruthless and individualistic, so they can maintain the status quo. But it's not what nurtures creativity. What nurtures creativity is a community which is accommodating and says, you've already succeeded just by trying. Let's see just how great this success can get. Let's consider your attempt the success, and everything that follows are just the fruits of your actions. Enjoy them. See, that is a family. That is a scene. That's what Brian Eno means when he refers to scenius rather than genius. That is a community that fosters true creativity, whether people like it or not. Irrespective of popularity, irrespective of the tribal midbrain, irrespective of status, irrespective of all the non-science. I say irrespectful rather than just irrespective, because I don't have respect for that kind of structured bullshit. I'm a Taoist in many ways, and I believe in that metaphor of that compares the bureaucrat to the briarweed that says, my role in the jungle is I'm going to control things, and just strangles all. It's not sound leadership. Which is not to say that someone can't be a great leader. But, he would be recognized by someone who's a terrible one or tyrannical one. You see, it's a moral problem. Because morality says you have to behave in such a way that if everyone did as you did, the world would prosper. Now, we usually think, oh, that is tyrannical. That's forcing things onto the world. No. No, 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 no. Once you've made a decision, you've made it for everyone. You have every right to the full extent of your individual potential, which will never be as powerful nor as terrible as the mob. You have every right to push what you consider to be right. Now, if it's arbitrary, okay, then you have a problem, especially when people start following your example. But that's why you have a whole tradition of morality to draw on from the entirety of human history that's evolved alongside us. And it's fairly universal in some respects. I mean, you can definitely see why people would say that we were at one point all one civilization. You can also see why another kind of person would say, no, we're not. We're not all alike. It's not like we're all genetically nearly identical. See, it's all a matter of perspective. What's the x-axis? What's the y-axis, right? You see, this is the moral problem, because theoretically, if you benefit from science, if you benefit from art, if you benefit from philosophy and technology, and you do, then you have to revere the artist or the rogue scientist, because they are participating in that tradition. They are honoring that God. They are setting an example and following an example that was set. Even if they fail, they're doing the right thing. That's the moral tradition. And you also owe a debt to that. See. So, I feel we have a moral obligation to acknowledge astrology, acknowledge how ordinary people who have not gained status have found the truth. And it's like I said, there are two theories, two ways you can really go about that. Can see it. One is you consider the possibility that there's this other dimension which is greater than scientific knowledge, and that takes precedence over scientific knowledge. Then there's the opposite point of view, which says that the human will takes absolute precedence over any kind of metaphysical influence. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that these two theories are equal. I am saying that this former theory, which admittedly I developed in order to explain astrology, and that's my only bias in its favor, if I had, though I'm really trying to sum up what other people have put forth. I'm saying that's the better one. But I am saying that for the same reason that people condemn the one, they uphold the other. It isn't just that by upholding the one, they preclude the other. It isn't just that because I have such a bias in my own favor that I completely exclude the other, and that's why they can't be reconciled. I am saying that for the sake that a two-pronged argument can have one root. That the same way that people condemn my theory, or would condemn my theory, is how they elevate their own, but it's the same bias at the root. They're not even two arguments, essentially. They're just one. They're not two strong arguments, they're just one very weak one. On the one hand, you presume upon human knowledge because it's human, however limited it might be. And on the other hand, you presume upon the human will that produce that knowledge, but that can easily dismiss it at any moment. Because it's human. So it must be stronger than the gods. Now, the key thing that shows that this is a bias is because when you combine them, they clash. The human will can deny scientific knowledge as much as it fucking wants. Or it can choose to fund this research rather than that research if it has money. And our whole economic system is based on laissez-faire. The notion that the will can do whatever it wants. But human life, time and time again, shows us that hubris ends in tragedy. So, there's nothing noble about it. It's not even consistent with itself. Science and willpower clash. Because the will's random and science tries to make sense of things. Where is our salvation? In the stars. Thank you very much. I'll leave 5 seconds for questions.